It's the weekend, and you and your friends have plans to go to the beach, which means a few good things. Tasty food, drinks, sand, and of course, that sweet, sweet sun. But when you guys arrive, the rain starts coming down hard, and your plans are ruined, at least temporarily. As not to worry, you can just wait it out. But what if it keeps raining, and raining, and raining, and you guessed it, raining. And let's say for 1,000 years it is nothing but dreary weather. Well, at that point I doubt you'd still be around, and if you were, I'd tell you to suck it up, as 1,000 years of rain is actually a mercy compared to what took place roughly 234 million years ago, when one day it started raining and then didn't stop for nearly 2 million years. This was the Carnian Pluvial episode. As its name so nicely puts it, this bizarre event in history took place during the Carnian, one of the 6 stages that make up the Triassic, and the first stage of the late portion of it. In general, it's widely regarded as a fairly normal and tame stage, as far as the Triassic goes, which isn't saying a whole lot given the whole wackiness of this period. At that time, most of the world's land was still tied up into the massive supercontinent of Pangaea, which spanned over 1/3 of the planet's surface, while the superocean Panthalassa and the smaller ocean, the Paleotethys, were essentially dominating the rest of the globe. In the weather and climate department, things were Triassic as usual too, meaning a whole lot of hot and arid weather that resulted in many areas being straight up sand or rocks. However, there were distinct wet seasons that you definitely couldn't miss, and I mean that literally, as the extreme land-to-sea distribution led to something called mega monsoons, which, if you can guess, were monsoons that were absolutely supercharged, being far more intense than any monsoons around today. So this in turn, with the general just crummy environment, meant that big swathes of the interior Pangaea, which laid close to the equator, were straight up uninhabitable for the vast majority of life. And the problem with the interiors were only further exacerbated by the presence of the central Pangaean mountains, which lay near the center of the massive landmass and essentially split it into 2, resulting in a clear north and south. And these mountains were not only wide, but also extremely tall, which led to them casting something called rain shadows, massive ones, resulting in some areas somehow being even drier, while they also influenced the mega monsoons, making them just a tad bit more unpredictable, which is saying something. So no doubt, this was one chaotic phase for Mother Nature. Yet, life still managed to do its thing, especially along the coast and southern regions, where the climate was a bit more reasonable. And actually, life during the Carnian had been able to ramp up quite a bit, with things starting to get quite interesting. Part of this has to do with the fact that the Great Dying had taken place just before the Triassic, which had been bad enough that life's recovery was still happening. So in other words, new things are always popping up left and right, including a group you've definitely heard of, the dinosaurs. Yup, it was in this relatively unheard time that the most famous prehistoric group of animals first emerged, or at least the first unequivocal true dinosaurs did. Our knowledge about these OGs mainly stems from the Santa Maria Formation, a locality that sat within Pangaea in Brazil and was composed of semi-arid lands, where sparse forests and the odd river or two rested. And if you time traveled back here, you would find within a novel type of creature, the Styracosaurus, a 2.25 meter or 7 foot 5 inch long Herrerasauridae. In other words, a type of dinosaur, who was also, by the way, among the largest dinos of the time. But that's still not much, as it only needed to weigh the same as a medium-sized dog in order to hold this achievement. And this smaller size, opposed to its later kin, limited its diet to small and equally medium-sized vertebrates, like cynodonts, rhynchosaurs, and various synapsids. So, it was certainly an oddball of a dino, yet, funny enough, it was also the normal one in Santa Maria, as things get a bit stranger when you take a look at the only other known dinosaur, the Bryolestes, an even smaller dinosaur who had sharp teeth, sharp claws, and get this, 2 legs. So, clearly a theropod, right? No. What you're looking at is actually a sauropodomorpha, which meaning that one day, it, or its descendants, would give rise to the giant herbivorous sauropods. But for now it was a little meat eater, and we know that it was not a theropod because it possessed a downturned jaw tip and a long deltopectoral crest on the humerus, both characteristics seen in only sauropodomorphs. But visually looking at this guy, I do have to admit it's kind of a tough connection to make. And in general, nearly every dinosaur is like these guys, 2-legged and small. But that being said, do not underestimate them, because they came in great numbers. Kind of, as alongside them lived a large amount of non-dinosaur dinosaur forms. In other words, the next best thing to dinosaurs, being the closest related things to them ever, but which didn't quite hit the mark. And some of the genera at the time included Lagosuchus, Marsuchus, and Saltopus, who were even smaller than their more derived kin. And if you saw them at a passing glance, you might have confused them for some strange lizard running around on its 2 back legs. But regardless, the presence of Dinosauromorpha was indeed very exciting, and by association was great news for the archosaurs, who were also cooking up a few things besides the terrible lizards, as it was in this stage that we see some of the most iconic animals of the late Triassic appear, such as things like the Rauisuchians, Phytosaurs, Eodosaurs, and more. You name it, and the Carnian likely had it. And when I say that, this does extend to non-archosaurs as well, as other new faces included the earliest Lepidosaurs, which included the ancestor of modern-day lizards, snakes, and tuataras. And you even had the first Shivasaurids and Pterosaurimorpha appear as well, which weren't actually pterosaurs as you might imagine them, but rather their ancestors that had somewhat pterosaur-like forms, which though in many cases lacked wings, yet retained structures that were like those of their later descendants. And in the water, things were cooking up too, with some new faces including the earliest Placodonts, a unique, now extinct order of marine reptiles that superficially looked like marine iguanas or like shell turtles. And we also see belemnites appear in the Carnian as well, an order of squid-like cephalopods that would eventually become a major part of the marine ecosystem, all the way up to the late Cretaceous, in some cases achieving some pretty remarkable sizes. But for now, they remained kawaii size. So, with this all said, evidently the Carnian as a whole was a spicy time for life. But this was really all just a teaser of what was to come, as in the background, things were underway that would soon have intense ramifications. Namely, along the western coast of North America, you would have found the massive Rangelia flood basalts, a type of large igneous province, commonly abbreviated to LIP. Now, if you've been following me long enough, you know this only means trouble, as LIPs are well known for being chaos harbingers. I mean, just take a look at the Permian extinction or Triassic extinction, both catastrophic events that were due to the eruption of, guess what, LIPs. And it was around this time in the Carnian, aka 234 million years ago, that the Rangelia flood basalts finally erupted, and they did so in brilliant fashion, spewing untold amounts of lava as well as various gases, including one very common face in present-day world-changing events, and events overall, carbon dioxide. Now let's just say, the Rangelia basalt, even for its huge size, released an abnormal amount of this stuff, which flooded the ocean atmosphere system and leading to worldwide global warming, with temperatures rising as much as 4 to 8 degrees Celsius or 7 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, making things quite toasty to say the least. Meanwhile, the rise in CO2 likely caused an extreme acceleration of the hydrological cycle, which basically supercharged continental weathering. And it wasn't just the amount of released carbon dioxide that caused such a switch up, but also the speed, for these eruptions were short and sweet, ejecting this stuff at rates typically not seen. And to make things a little more dire, it seems that along with carbon dioxide, these volcanoes also contained atypical volumes of methane clathrates, which, without getting too sciencey, is basically something that is 86 times more powerful than CO2 when it comes to global warming potential, exacerbating things just that much more. And so, when you combine all this global warming and acceleration of the hydrological cycle, one thing began to happen. Rain. And rain, and rain. The Carnian pluvial event had officially begun. Now, we don't know, and probably will never know, just how intense this rain was, but we can say for certain that it was coming down in unimaginable amounts, with it having essentially been pouring dinosaurs and pseudoseuchians rather than cats and dogs. Yeah, it was that wild. In fact, the rain was so extreme that we even have clear evidence for its existence through certain rock formations, where the rain had eroded the sediment enough to have exposed the actual basement rock, which, just for reference, are rocks laying right above the mantle and sit below all other sediments and rock, usually being buried miles below the surface. So yeah, a lot of rain erosion is needed to expose them. Other signs that there was a stupid amount of rain during this time also included the widespread abundance of amber in certain paleosoils that only form when precipitation far exceeds the amount of water being evaporated. And as you know, the amount of rain was not the only ridiculous thing, as like I mentioned, the duration was unbelievable too, saying that it lasted, up to 2 million years. 2 million years of perpetual rain. Well, I will admit that perpetual might be a bit dramatic, because despite the common trope that it rained non-stop for 2 million years during this event, it probably didn't. Instead, you would have found this time to have had much higher rates of rain than usual, with events of hyper-extreme precipitation sprinkled in. No pun intended. And the Carnian pluvial wasn't just all about rain, as in general, the climate drastically switched from dry to unusually humid. Basically think the wettest, soupiest rainforest possible, transforming much of the planet into tropical lush regions that would have given the Carboniferous a good run for its money when it came to swampy-like vibes, with peat forests even having been re-established in this event. And a few other things that became more common during the CPE included floodplains and marshes on massive scales, while giant inland lakes that might have dwarfed the Great Lakes of today were also present, making this world 100% thalassophobia certified. However, like most things, where there is a push, there is a pull. And while never-ending rain was the rule during this event, it turns out that dryness remained during the Carnian pluvial episode. On top of periodic episodes, where arid conditions would partially return, some studies have also suggested that certain areas were backstabbed by this event, becoming in fact more arid than ever before. And this included just about the driest place in history, the interiors of Pangaea. As mentioned, during the early and middle Triassic, these interrealms of the continent were basically inhabitable to life, being hot enough to essentially cook a wide variety of meats, including, by the way, living ones, and being so dry that massive deserts took hold. And thus, if they were really made worse by the Carnian pluvial episode, I doubt anything could live within these extreme pockets. Yet, I digress. In general, we're talking about over 1 million years of humid, relentless, rainy weather. And to some this might sound like a cozy time, like those cyberpunkish cities where it's always raining. But in reality, this event was less on the cozy spectrum and more on the world-ending or changing spectrum. Because it turns out that too much rain throws things into array, and the pluvial event is considered to be a forgotten extinction of sorts, with the changes to the environments, worldwide flooding, and global warming ending up in very high background rates of extinction. And actually, before this rainy event was even hypothesized, scientists were already aware that major die-offs had occurred during the Carnian. They just weren't sure why. But now they know. Now, perhaps surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, while you do not feel the rain itself much underwater, it was in fact marine life that seems to have gotten battered the most, with one hypothesis being that the pluvial event altered the oceans by reducing their carbonate platforms, and thereby severely harming carbonate-forming animals, resulting in large amounts of conodonts, ammonoids, and bryozoa dying out, while algae and crinoids took a massive hit as well. And on top of that, can you guess what 1 million years of rain could do to an ocean? Which, is a salty body of water? Yeah, dilute it. And there's pretty good evidence that this happened, with the ocean's salinity decreasing by quite a bit, which to me or you wouldn't feel like much, but for certain marine animals would have been literal torture, totally disrupting their homeostasis, and adding again to the higher background extinction rate. Now on the flip side, on land, the situation was a bit less dire, but still definitely not perfect, as there were more than a few animals that had a tough time dealing with the flooding, rain, and general transformation of environments. And one of the main groups to get pelted was one I've already briefly named, the Dinosaurs. This was a group of herbivorous Crocopoda, meaning they were closer to archosaurs than lepidosaurs, and had first appeared during the early days of the Triassic, finding great success quickly and becoming quite abundant in certain parts of Pangaea, sometimes in fact accounting for 40 to 60% of all specimens from a formation. And reflecting this, at the start of the Carnian, they could not have been doing any better. Originally, they had been on the small side and had lizard-like builds, but now they'd achieved lengths up to 2 meters and attained more robust builds, while their faces lengthened and became more triangular. And everything seemed like it was only going to get better for them. But the Carnian pluvial event seemingly had other ideas, and the Dinosaurs were absolutely battered during these years, with the main idea being that they couldn't keep up with the change in forests, with their preferred vegetation becoming rarer and rarer. And essentially, every family died off except for one, the Hyperodapodontinae, and still not even these guys lasted much longer, disappearing the very next stage. So these guys had a pretty valid reason to hate the rain, which by the way, so did the Dicynodonts. This group needs no introduction, having given us plenty of iconic animals like the Placerias or Lystrosaurus. But for refresher's sake, this was a very diverse group of non-mammalian therapsids that were herbivores and typically possessed tusks, thus their name, which means two dog-toothed. Now, unlike many of the others I've named so far, these guys had actually been around since the Permian, and like the Dinosaurs, had been doing just fine, but for similar reasons, found themselves struggling during the pluvial event, and many of the living groups of the time wound up going extinct. Yet they would end up faring a tad bit better than the Dinosaurs, persisting a tad bit longer given their greater diversity. But nevertheless, they too still disappeared, going extinct around 211 million years ago. But with that said, what's very odd about the Carnian pluvial event is that while background extinction rates were abnormally high at this time, I dare say that more animals and organisms have it to thank, as many walks of life actually received quote-unquote power-ups because of it, including of course the biggest rain lovers out there, plants and trees. As the lands took a step back from the arid paradigm, flora unsurprisingly began a strong comeback, with forests and swamps sprouting all over the world. And it was during this time that ferns, conifers, and the Benacetalians heavily diversified, leading to them becoming the mainstays of Mesozoic flora. And the level up seen in forests, as well as the rise of inland lakes and lush environments, ultimately had a beneficial impact on various creatures, including, by the way, the future mighty rulers of Earth, the dinosaurs. Yep, as it so turns out, It might have been this rainy event that was an essential step in their development, with their diversity, diversification rate, and size greatly increasing after the CPE. And actually, the overall abundance of dinosaurs also ticked upwards during the Carnian pluvial event. Informations go from yielding a couple dinosaur genera to sometimes nearly 10. And perhaps the best example for this is the Isco-Gusto Formation out of Argentina, which had at least 8 different kinds of dinosaurs living within it, including multiple sauropodomorphs and Herrerasaurids. Amongst them, you would have even found the Herrerasaurus itself, which was one of the largest predatory dinosaurs to have lived throughout the entire Triassic, with specimens growing up to 6 meters or 20 feet long, and possessing large serrated teeth, allowing them to hunt a large range of vertebrates they lived alongside, while also becoming one of the more common carnivores in this specific ecosystem, with over 50 different specimens having been recovered. Other specific genera included the likes of Eoraptor, Eodromeus, Antioevis, Panphagia, and San Juansaurus, who was itself, by the way, not much smaller than the Herrerasaurus. Additionally, it's only after this event that we see the rise of the first giant dinosaurs, as it's during the Norian, some 228 million years ago, that we get the evolution of Lesomsaurus, one of the largest Triassic dinosaurs of all time, being a sauropod that measured 12 meters or 39 feet long, and weighed possibly up to 10 metric tons, near the record weight of an African elephant. So, not much compared to the Jurassic and Cretaceous sauropods, but impressive nonetheless. However, having said this, you must remember that the Triassic was not the dinosaurs' heyday. There were other, more prominent groups about, who also got their own power-ups after the CPE. And this largely involved the Aeotosaurus, who became one of the most dominant animals on land, and were archosaurs more related to crocodiles than birds and dinosaurs. It's easy to call this group a odd bunch, as on the surface, they looked like armored medium to large-sized croc-like creatures, yet they were terrestrial and usually herbivorous or at the most omnivorous, not predatorial. And it seems they vastly benefited from the new forests which emerged, being able to better specialize in conifers and ferns compared to previous orders like the Rhynchosaurs. As another huge winner in all of this happened to be a somewhat close relative of the Aeotosaurs, albeit a tad more bloodthirsty, and that was the semi-aquatic Phytosaurs. It's not hard to imagine why a group of semi-aquatic carnivores would do well after, well, a lot of rain, with the rise of swamps and giant mega lakes being the Phytosaurs' equivalent of taking a huge whiff of smelling salts. And very rapidly, they diversified, increasing their range and ballooning in size, getting essentially large enough that they could take on just about anything, meaning that even sauropods of certain sizes had to be on edge whenever taking a sip of fresh water, and honestly giving me just one more reason why to stay away from giant pitless lakes. And while not to the same degree, it seems that turtles and crocodilomorphs made some headway as well, further diversifying. So who knows, maybe we have a 234 million year old rainstorm to thank for crocs and turtles today. Of course though, I can't talk about a Triassic event without actually mentioning how the true terrestrial rulers, as far as predators go, fared. Which would be, by the way, the Rauisuchians, a diverse group of usually quadrupedal, terrifying archosaurs that had wicked jaws, armor, and bad tempers. They had already established themselves as the dominant predators at this point, and were found virtually worldwide, while also nearly always being an apex predator within their respective ecosystems. However, despite their power level, they, like all animals, were impacted by the CPE, but what kind of changes the pluvial event incurred on them is a bit more ambiguous, as there is debate on the extent of its influence, with some stating that even if it hadn't occurred, not much would change in the Rauisuchians' timeline, which, obviously, is a timeline that ends with extinction. Although, with this said, there are a few interesting things which have been observed in this group and the timing of the event. For starters, while the Rauisuchians have been fairly diverse throughout much of the late Triassic, a good chunk of genera only pop up during the Carnian, and more specifically, around or directly after the eternal rainstorm. On top of that, while they also were always quite sizey, there does seem to be an increase in body stature only following the rain. This could have been sheer coincidence, of course, yet interesting regardless, and was sour news for all non-Rauisuchian life, as it's around this time that we start to see genera like the Saurosuchus, a massive unit of a member that was 23 feet or 7 meters long and weighed about half a ton, while the even bigger Fasciolosuchus also only appears following the Carnian, albeit much later on. And even though it may be that these changes were unlinked to the Carnian's pluvial episode, I think it's fair to say that 2 million years of rain still had a rather large impact on the planet, and changed its course forever. Which thus only leaves one more question, which is, what happened afterwards? What's the conclusion? Well, eventually, like all things, the volcano stopped erupting and the rain slowly subsided, leading to a resume in the arid, dry, and hot conditions that we know of so well. However, while things in some ways returned to normal, the impacts of the Carnian pluvial event were lasting, as changes undergone by animals because of it would ultimately lead to certain results seen down the road, either directly or indirectly. So, the next time it rains, I want you to remember this video and thank it for giving us crocodiles and turtles. Maybe. Thanks for watching, and until next time, on ExtinctZoo.